Hey, how's it going everyone? This is Brendan Bias from checkit.com and welcome to another Tutorial Tuesday. In this week's tutorial, I'm going to be showing you guys a recreation of a wallpaper that I found on Deviantart. And just to show it off, give some credit where credit is due, this is called Rainbowfest. It's this top picture right here, and it was created by this guy, Manicho. I think that's how you pronounce your name. Either way, this is, I don't know, I really like this particular wallpaper that he made. It's like this rolled up sheet of colorful awesomeness. Well, that was a fun description that I just came up with, huh? But anyway, I just thought it was really cool, and I decided to try and recreate it. Now, of course, it's not a perfect recreation, but I still think that it does the job. And I don't know, I really wanted to share it with you guys because I'm a big fan of simplistic wallpapers, and I also like wallpapers that have a lot of color to them. So this in itself was like perfect to me. It's beautiful, it's simple, and it's very, very appealing. So I just figured it might be something that you guys would enjoy. So just for the record, you might see a lot of layers going on over here, but this is very, very simple and straightforward to do, and you should do it in every version of Photoshop that is at least somewhat recent, like CS4, CS5, and so forth. If you have any problems with compatibility, just let me know and leave a comment in the comment section below. And also, while you guys are at it, please give this video a like, because this is kind of how I earn a living, is through YouTube. So the more likes that our videos have, the more popular that they might be, and thus the more money that I can earn and not have to work for some other BS company. So I would really appreciate it if you guys gave this video a like. So what do you say we get into our tutorial? So we'll make a new document. Let's do our regular 1920 by 1080 with a 72 pixels per inch resolution and a white background. And let's hit OK. And of course, starting off, let's hit Ctrl-0 to zoom into canvas size, and we'll double click our background layer, and we'll just leave it as layer 0 and hit OK. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is fill in this background with all of our fun colors. Now, I did take some precautions and made some swatches, so that way I didn't have to make up any new colors, and I knew that these would work. So let's select my first color, and this is a red color with the value of BB0000. Let's hit OK. And I'm going to switch over to my rectangular marquee tool, and I'm going to set the style from normal to fixed size. And right now I have a width of 1920, because that is the width of my document, and I have the height set to 154. So as for the height, just to show you guys how I came up with that, I basically decided that since I have 7 colors, I just need to divide that into the height of my document. So we have 1080 pixels divided by 7 colors gives us roughly 154 pixels in terms of height. So if you guys decide to use a different amount of colors for your own projects, that's how you can figure out how high to make each color. So we'll just click and drag somewhere on our document, and that'll make our first bar, and we'll put that way up top right there. And I'll just fill this in with the shortcut Alt Backspace, or that would be Option Delete if you're on a Mac, and that'll fill that in with our foreground color, which is that lovely shade of red. So let's click and drag this sucker downwards while holding Shift until it matches up with the bottom of our first color. And I'll go back and select the next color up, which is FFB400, and we'll fill that in. And then moving on, let's bring this back down, make sure it's not overlapping, and let's select our next color, which is this lovely yellow with a value of F7DF00. Fill that in. And then moving on down below, make sure it's not overlapping. Very nice. Let's select our freaking awesome shade of purple, which is A52B76. Hit OK. Fill that in. And moving on, going further on down, make sure that doesn't overlap again. And the cool shade of blue that we have here is 137599. Let's fill this sucker in once again. And moving on down here, let's select our green. And our green value is 46C32A. Hit OK. Fill that in. And then move on to our final color, and let's nudge that on. And this shade is a sort of red violet with the value of C80E3A. And we'll hit OK, and we'll fill that in. And you'll notice that since that little math that we did was like 154.28 pixels rather than a flat 154, we have a couple pixels left over. So we'll just nudge down our marquee and fill those in with that same color. Nice and simple. Alright, so now that we've got this all filled in and it looks nice and beautiful, let's go ahead and fix our marquee tool. Let's put that back to normal. And let's also reset our foreground and background color so they're the default black and white. Now what we're going to do here is make a selection around the left hand side for that basically for that roll of paper that we have on the left hand side. And we are going to cut this and put it into a new layer. So you can either do that by hitting Control X and then Control V, but then that puts that somewhere like off into the middle, so you have to put it back where it was. Or you have option 2, which I find is much easier, is to use a shortcut Control Shift J or Command Shift J if you're on a Mac. And so that'll just cut that piece and put that into a new layer exactly where it is. So now we have the left hand piece and the right hand piece. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and rename these as our rolled up piece. And let's do the flattened piece. You know, something along that to make it nice and easy to distinguish. So let's go ahead and transform our rolled piece by hitting Control or Command T. And let's just scale this up by clicking one of the edges or one of the corners and hold Alt and Shift. And we're just going to scale that up ever so slightly. Let's maybe do something more along those lines. And we want to warp this. So one way you can do that is to right click and choose warp. Or if you go up top, you'll see we have these 3 icons and you can just use this far left one to kind of toggle the warp. Alright, so once you have this set to warp, you're going to have a little bit of fun. So let's start off by clicking and dragging from the bottom middle, and we'll click that down. And maybe move that off to the left a little bit. And we'll do the same thing with the top middle. Drag that up. Move it a little to the left. And then maybe we'll just kind of click and drag some of these corners out over to the side. Something along those lines. And that's looking pretty good. And let's also bring in this top corner and this bottom corner. We'll bring that closer in somewhere around right here. And if you guys need to, you can also go in and mess with these center bits, and just make them look a little bit more round. But I think it's actually looking pretty good, so I'm going to go up top and hit the little check mark to commit that transformation. So one thing that you'll notice, I'm going to turn off the flattened layer real quick, is that by doing this, we'll have a little bit of random like warping going on between the colors, and B, this right-hand edge will no longer be completely flat. So what you are going to want to consider doing is A, either deal with this random warping going on between the colors, or B, go back in and use the pen tool to create some perfect shapes. And I don't want to waste my time doing that right now, so I'm just going to go ahead and deal with the fact that there's a little bit of warping going on in the colors. Now, as for our other problem with the right-hand edge not being entirely flat, that is a really easy fix. We'll just go back and grab our rectangular marquee tool. Let's make a selection that just has a little bit of that right edge selected. And let's actually zoom in and make sure that we do have that entire edge selected. So you can see that it gets a little thicker, and then towards... Actually, no, it just gets a little bit thicker, and then at the very bottom, it was a little thin. So let's just use our delete key to delete that, and we'll have a nicely perfect and flat edge. All right, so let's turn on the flattened layer and make sure that we have everything all ship-shape right now. Looking good. So next thing we're going to do is go to the rolled layer and give that sucker a double click to bring up the layer styles. And let's start off by adding in a gradient overlay. And for this, we're going to set the blend mode to screen, and we're going to toggle the reverse for the gradients. We're going to change it from linear to reflected, and we'll set the angle to 0. And so this should be what you get. It's a reflected white gradient. Make sense? Good. So now what we're going to do is not double click, but just click on the gradient here. And we're going to edit this so that this is a little bit more mellowed out. So let's double click the white slider and just kind of bring it down a couple notches so that way it's not quite so intense. And we'll click OK. Now let's click and add another point. Let's do this around 40%. And we're going to make this into a kind of middle ground shade of gray. Maybe we'll put that down a little bit more. Maybe somewhere around there might be pretty good. This particular part, there's no exact science to it. It's just a little bit of going back and forth between the shades to see what looks pretty good. So let's hit OK for the time being. And when you have either this middle slider or this right-hand slider selected, you'll notice that we have this little midpoint. And we want to click and drag that to about 80%. And so what that's going to do is make it so that the fade between this and the midpoint is a lot longer. So now we have this kind of like more harsh shine in the middle, and then it just gradually fades out to the edge there. So that's actually looking pretty good to me. So let's just see what colors I used. I have E4, E4, E4 for the very right-hand side. The middle one is 62, 62, 62, and then that fades out to black. So that's looking good. We'll hit OK. However, I do want to click and drag to move this a little off to the left-hand side so it matches that little peak in the curve that we have. And since that's looking pretty good where it is, let's go apply a drop shadow. Whoa, you're getting a little tongue twisted here. And for this, let's put the opacity up to 100%. Let's toggle off the reverse and change that to 180 degrees. Let's put up the distance to about 20, and then we'll max out the size at 250. So that's looking like a pretty nice drop shadow. However, I do see a little bit of banding going on, so I'm going to put the noise at 1% to try and smooth that out a little bit. Alright, now that those two things are done, we can hit OK and move on to our next step, which is to add a little bit of a shadow on the right-hand edge of the roll. So let's make a new layer, and we're going to call this our roll shadow. And I want this roll shadow to only be applied to what happens on the rolled layer. So I'm going to make the roll shadow into a clipping mask. And to do that, we're going to hold the Alt key. That would be the Option key if you're on a Mac. And I'm going to move my mouse between the rolled and roll shadow layers, and it'll turn the mouse into this box with a downwards pointing arrow. And when you give that a click, you'll see that the roll shadow changes a little bit. It has a little downwards pointing arrow next to the thumbnail. And that is a good sign that you now have a clipping mask. So now what will happen is if we switch over to our brush tool by hitting the letter B, and I'm going to right click and make sure that I have a hardness of 0%. I'm going to size down the brush considerably, so that looks like a good size at about 300 pixels, and I can hit the enter key to commit that. So what I'm going to do is put my brush kind of close to the edge of the roll. I might size that up just a little bit actually. And now what I can do is hold the Shift key and click and drag downwards. And that'll add a very slight shadow to the edge right there. And since this is a clipping mask, it's only going to be applied to that roll. And if we didn't do that, you'll see that it actually creates this great big stroke of black, which we don't want. So that's where the clipping mask comes in handy. You'll only see that little bit of soft shading on that edge there. So that kind of helps it look a little bit more authentic with it kind of rolling around like that. Alright, so now that that is looking pretty good, let's go to our flattened layer, and let's bring up the transform tool by hitting Ctrl or Command T once again, and let's just kind of scale this one up a little bit as well, and let's toggle the warp, and from here on you should have a general idea of what it is you're going to be doing. So just kind of mess around and see what you can get that looks pretty good. I'm going to bring in these colors in the middle like so. I might stretch those back out a little bit, and I'm going to click and drag this corner out here, and I might drag this one down over there, and let's just make this look like it's something like that. Might stretch that out a little bit, stretch that out a little bit, And we're getting a good shape here. Might move that a little bit more down over to there. All right. So I'm getting a pretty good vibe from this. I like how it's looking. That, and I don't feel like spending forever tweaking this because this is just a quick little demonstration for you guys. So I'm going to hit the little check mark up top to commit that transformation. However, I did notice that I kind of left a little bit of a gap at the very bottom. So I'm just going to select that color with my swatches from before, and I'm going to use my brush tool to just kind of fill that in. Keep it nice and simple, right? Okay, so I want to make this pop a little bit more, so let's add a gradient overlay. And for this, let's change that to radial. Let's toggle the reverse and change the scale to 50%. And let's click OK. Looking all right, I suppose. But what we're going to do with this is, you can see on the right-hand side, we have the effects icon, and under the effects, we have the gradient overlay. So let's right-click the gradient overlay and choose Create Layer. And so now what we'll do is bring up the transform tool for this with Control or Command T, and let's just stretch this out until it's more of a cool looking like a what is that? An ellipse. Thank you. That was sad if I couldn't remember the name of a freaking ellipse. So just kind of stretch that out until it looks something a little bit better like that. And let's hit the check mark to commit that transformation. And I'm going to set this to a blend mode of, let's do linear light. And we'll set that to a fill of, say, let's try 6%. And so what you'll see that do is it'll kind of create a sort of spotlight in the middle, and it'll very slightly darken the edges around it. However, I don't want to do that, just by itself. I want to actually have a cool little highlight in the middle, so let's duplicate this flattened gradient by hitting Control or Command J on our keyboard. And this time, let's set that to screen with a fill of, let's try 45%. And see, now we're getting something that looks a little bit better here. But let's bring up the transform tool and let's kind of stretch this out a little bit more. And maybe we'll move this off to the right-hand side a little bit. So somewhere over here might look pretty good. I'm liking how that's turning out. So let's commit that transformation by hitting the little check mark. And while we're at it, let's also duplicate this again by hitting Control or Command J. And this time, let's put the fill down to like 20%. And let's move this one over to the left. And let's put that somewhere right there is all right. So you're basically going to duplicate that and move it over just so that way it's like a secondary fill. All right. So now we have 3 layers. We have one that's kind of meant for darkening up the edges, and we have one as a main fill light and a second one as a secondary fill light. So if you don't want to do that, I understand it's a little bit weird, but I find it kind of cool and handy. So anyway, moving on, let's actually go back and edit this gradient here because this one has a nice little like fall off to it, and this one just goes straight up and down. So let's go back and select the rolled layer, and let's open that up, right-click one of the effects, and choose Create Layers. And we'll hit OK. And so that'll make the drop shadow into a new layer and the rolled gradient into a new layer as well. So let's add a layer mask to the rolled gradient, go back to our brush tool, and maybe we'll scale that up with the right bracket key. And with black as your foreground color, just kind of very gently add in a fade to the edges. So something like that should be pretty decent. So I think that looks all right. I might put down the opacity just a little bit. Okay, that looks pretty good to me. However, I do want to add in some texture on top of this. So we'll make a new layer. We're going to rename this as our texture. And we'll just fill this in with our either the foreground or the background color. It doesn't really matter. So Alt backspace on that. Let's put the fill down to 0% so we don't see that anymore. And let's double click this texture layer and add a pattern overlay. And what I have here, if you open up the pattern and choose the little cog settings, I loaded up the erodible textures. So give those a click OK. And I'm going to use one of these very last ones. I'll just use the very last one. And I'm going to set that to overlay with an opacity of like, let's just try 10%. That doesn't look half bad. We'll click OK. The purpose of this is to add a very slight bit of texture on top, and that'll also help out with smoothing over some of those spotlights and stuff. Excuse me. Whew. So now that we've got a little bit of texture in, I have one last thing that I want to add, and that is that's a vignette. So once again, let's go to our foreground and background color and reset those to black and white. And let's go to layer. Let's choose a new fill layer and choose a gradient. And we'll call this our vignette. We'll click OK. And for this vignette, let's change the style to radial, the angle at 30 degrees with a scale of 150. We'll toggle the reverse and the dither. And then let's click the gradient and move the top right opacity stop, and we'll move that down to like 40%. And we'll click OK, click OK again. And just to show you that this actually did something, I'll turn that off, turn that on, and you'll see that that really did add in a slight little vignette on the edges. All right, so what do you say we take a look at this beautiful masterpiece? Alright guys, so that was really all there is to making this. It's pretty simple and straightforward. There are a couple of steps that you need to take in order to, to make this just right. And I don't know, I think this went really well, but if you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask me. Just leave a comment in the comment section below, and I would be more than happy to help you guys out, as long as you're not asking the generic question like, what's up with my wallpaper or something like that. I've already answered that like 300 times. But anyway guys, I really do hope that you enjoyed this tutorial, and I would really appreciate some feedback on it if you would, care to do that. And that's really all I have for you guys for today, so I will see you next Tuesday. Peace out.